We are live. Welcome to Michael Roberts, the famous or infamous economist and Marxist, who's been analysing the world capitalist system for how long? Have you been doing this sort of thing?
Well, I won't mention my age, Heiko, but obviously I've been looking at the world economy as a professional economist for decades, and obviously in recent years concentrating on the collapse in capitalism, which took place in really the Great Recession of 2008-9 and onwards, and providing as much as I can information about what's been happening and theories about that over the last 20 years. So.
And you kind of lived a sort of double life, yeah? Sort of one foot in the business world and one foot in the Marxist world. What sort of insights does that allow you to get?
Well, it does allow you to often working for companies, either financial institutions or small research houses, which have big clients, not you and me as individuals about our money, but big institutions who've got billions to invest or to speculate on the stock market or in other financial markets. And when you meet these people, then they're discussing always how to make money out of a situation, including a crisis like we're in at the moment. How can we make money out of a pandemic? When should we buy the market when it's dropped enough? Should we buy or sell a dollar to try and make a bob? They're looking at that attitude. And one of the things that strike me in the recent pandemic crisis is a very cynical attitude amongst some of the executive suites who see the argument as saying, well, in many ways, it's not bad, this pandemic. It's getting rid of a lot of old people who aren't very productive, a lot of sick people who aren't very productive, because that's how the virus seems to be aiming most of its victims. And so perhaps after this, once we've cleansed out a lot of unnecessary wood amongst human population, we'll have a more productive and more amenable workforce. And I'm seriously saying that sort of discussion does go on in the boardrooms of certain financial institutions.
But this is also a long economic tradition, this idea of creative destruction and, clearing out the old wood, which of course has a human element to it. It's not necessarily a pandemic, but it's a generic element to the whole.
Well, there are two aspects. First, back in the early 19th century, the view of the early classical political economists was a very cynical attitude like that. Most famous was Reverend Thomas Malthus, a reactionary parson, which Marx and Engels spent a lot of time and ink attacking. And his theory was that it was inevitable that population would exceed the ability to produce enough food for people, and therefore, by a natural process, survival of the fittest, every so often there will be some sort of food and population crisis, which lead to the devastation of the weaker elements in society and create the conditions for new growth. That was often why, and it was also combined with other views of the classical economists that said you can't ever really raise wages at all in people's incomes. They're going to be stuck like an iron law at a certain level of subsistence. That's why it was called the economics of misery in those days, and that attitude remains. The idea of creative destruction is slightly different. It was developed particularly by Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, who said, well, every so often there's a slump, a big crisis, it clears out a lot of old, useless companies. And we see that only in the last few weeks, companies going to the wall that we'll never see again as a result of this slump through the pandemic. Lots of companies closing down who won't return. And in a way, it's again, as you say, clearing out the wood so that the stronger elements in the economy can come to the fore, mop up anything that's available from ones that have collapsed, and then there'll be a new level of possibility for innovation and technological development and a new period of growth for capitalism. So one has a theory which says the people have got to die, and the other one says that capitalism can grow by killing off the old companies, what is sometimes called nowadays the zombie companies, the companies that can't really survive except by struggling bit by bit, drip by drip of money they can get in.
At the start of the 20th century, in the run-up to the First World War, there were Marxists who were saying that war would be, if you like, an inevitable product of capitalism, that that the system of capitalism, through its internal crises, generates the contradictions that lead to war. And then we had 2 world wars in the 20th century. What is the connection between the economic system of capitalism and these explosions of crises which appear in various forms?
Well, capitalism, in my view, has an inherent contradiction in it. Its aim, amongst the many owners of the means of production, industry, services, finance, property, these people who own things are not producing things and employing people to work for them in the interest of developing a society as a whole, to meet social needs and resources, develop human potential. They're in it to make profits for their individual companies or operations, and so they're competing with each other to try and get more share of a market for any particular sector of production or service. And they're, of course, trying to keep the costs of that production down by keeping as much as possible the amount that goes to labor, to ordinary working people. So the 1%, as we popularly call it, who control all the means of production globally, are competing all the time. And on that basis, you get production, but also you get every so often on a regular basis crises, because Marx showed in his work in Capital on explaining the development of capitalism that there's a contradiction between trying to produce for profit and for meeting social need. And those two things come into contradiction on a regular basis through various laws which produce a fall in profitability and create the conditions for a crisis. So capitalists stop investing, stop producing, stop employing people, and the whole system collapses for a period of time before it's renewed, if you like, in this terms of creative destruction later on. So there's regular crises, and this conflict cannot be resolved without ending the capitalist mode of production. That's the argument of Marxism as against other theories which say that maybe we can modify capitalism, make it more humane, or maybe we can manage it in such a way that it will operate more harmoniously to maintain employment. Marx's view is that it's inherently impossible to do that without actually replacing that system. So that's why that contradiction remains. These crises can take many different forms when they actually happen. If we want to take the last one in 2008-9, this was due to the collapse of the banks internationally, huge credit bust and bubble burst across the world, and financial institutions melted down. As a result, they had to be bailed out by governments and so on. And lots of people lost their jobs as it fed into the productive system, and there was a big crash in production as well as finance. So it was a collapse originally in the housing market in the United States. In the 1929 crash, it was a collapse in the stock market, which led to that, and huge debts had to be written off, and we entered a Great Depression for 10 years. This time, you could say, is it out of the blue? It seems to be due to a virus, a pandemic that has come out of one part of the world and spread right across the world, causing such an increase or likely increase in deaths and destruction for human beings and the health system, that it's forced governments to carry out unprecedented level of locking down the economy, of reducing production by up to 50% in many countries, maybe more we'll see over the next couple of months or maybe longer. And as a result, causing a huge shock to supply, complete reduction in supply. I just saw estimates which said that the fall in output as a result of this pandemic that has hit capitalism and its productive process is bigger than anything seen in the last 175 years. I mean, maybe only for 2 quarters, maybe to the end of this year, who knows? But the actual fall and the rapidity of that fall has really not been seen since the days that we were talking about earlier, the early 19th century.
But in a way, is it, as opposed to the 2008 crash, when they intervened, when the crisis had happened, it's almost like they're taking such draconian measures that they are incorporating the crisis into their existing actions now. I mean, particularly the British government's intervention, the US government's intervention now, the discussions in Europe to what degree are they conscious of this, if you like, need to rejig the whole economy? Were they already conscious of this?
I think, well, if we're talking about rejigging the economy, I think the view of the majority of people running our economies was that they were doing the right things, that the economy was crawling along since the Great Recession. They had saved the banks, they'd saved the financial institutions. Productivity was poor, investment was poor. We probably needed to get more productivity out of labour. That means introducing technical innovation and so on. They were hoping to do this, but they found the only way they could get the economy to stagger along was pumping in yet more money, credit, debt. So the corporations were building up huge amounts of debt. They weren't particularly investing into productive assets, into new technology, better jobs, training the workforce. They were speculating in the stock market and the bond market rather than that, because they seemed the profitability was better there to speculate than to invest. But at least it was staggering along, and we were told every year that it would continue to be okay. The stock market reached new record highs in optimism about what was happening. And the idea that there was going to be a new slump, like in 2008-9, was generally dismissed. Before the pandemic, estimates made by the financial institutions of the likelihood of a new recession was about 10 to 15%. They did not think it was going to happen. They saw no need to change any particular policy as such. However, I think the evidence was already there that we were heading into a new slump. Profitability was falling, global profits were falling, investment was falling. Many economies around the world were already into a slump. Japan, Eurozone was close to it. Argentina, Mexico, South Africa, big economies were in slumps, and the situation was deteriorating already before we had the coronavirus hit the world in the way that it has done. So this was coronavirus in one way was a trigger for probably what was going to happen anyway, a slump in this year and forward. Now, obviously, they made a decision, and this is the decision you could say, and they're trying to reverse it as soon as possible, is that by locking down the world economy, they're, of course, making the slump even more severe than it might otherwise be. And the only way that they have to do that, for two reasons. One, if they just if they did nothing about the virus, then on any reasonable estimate, we're talking about 50 million deaths over the course of the period of the virus's spread across the world. 50 million deaths, and also health systems.
Where's that figure coming from? I mean, I've seen it somewhere, but
well, what you do is you could say, if you've heard of what's called herd immunity, which is what the epidemiologists and biologists say is that the virus spreads to everybody, and in a certain level of the percentage of the population, then it wanes because everybody's more or less immune from it. And that figure 60 or 70%. So if you take 60 or 70% of the world's population, and you say that the mortality rate is around about 1%, which it seems to be. I mean, it's much higher than that in every country at the moment. But if everybody got it, then probably the mortality rate's around about the level, which is 10 times higher than an influenza epidemic, by the way. Then you're talking around about 50 million people dying.
Well, it's a possibility. I mean, I doubt it would go as high as that, even in the worst case scenario. But in any case, it's a possibility.
But of course, so it couldn't possibly allow that to happen for two reasons. One, politically, it's disastrous. And for the health systems being completely overloaded, there was no way they'd be able to handle, I mean, we beat people in the street, bodies in the streets. So they had to resort eventually to this policy of lockdown, self-isolation, and other drastic measures in order to flatten the curve, as it's called, reduce the pace in which you reach the peak in the pandemic, flatten it out, lengthen it out so that health systems can cope, and that also once they can cope, then obviously you can reduce the amount of deaths. We're not going to get 50 million deaths.
I mean, there are a couple of countries, or the three countries really, that I'll try and ask you to talk about.
Yeah.
That have had they're reasonably sized countries, so there's some scope for comparison, and there's the different types of action taken in each, and also different economic structure and role of government in each. So China, Germany, and South Korea. what would you say are the distinctions, in particular between China we can come on to, but Germany and South Korea? What makes their system of capitalism more capable of dealing with the problem?
Well, the key thing, I think, in both of those is that they had capacity in their health systems to deal with this pandemic in two ways. First of all, they had high testing capability.
Yeah.
They had stocked up on testing and the equipment involved, and they had extra capacity also in beds, particularly acute beds, than any other of those other countries we can list. I was looking at the figures now, and they topped the league in their ability to capacity. So they had a health system that in some ways was better able to absorb a pandemic like this. Everywhere else, people have slashed their health systems. They've privatized them, they've marketized them, they've made them efficient to the point of saying that a health system is at 99% utilization all the time. And then in winter, you get influenza or something and it bursts open in many countries. They can't really cope for a brief period of time. And so they maximized the utilization, kept the nursing and medical staff at a minimum, paying them less, using it as a profit-making operation in the US and elsewhere, rather than something which is there to meet the dangers which a pandemic has. And very few countries have had the capacity to both test and then trace contacts, and then on the basis of tracing contacts, self-isolate, and then also having the beds available to deal with people who do get ill. And as a result, they've been able to keep the cases relatively low, the deaths relatively low, and the health system able to cope. But they are the exceptions, it seems to me. The other ones have not been able to do that. I was looking at the list, and hardly any country in Europe has got enough beds now to cope with this crisis. They're right on the edge or over in many cases, and some of them, of course, haven't even peaked there yet, like the UK. So that seems to me the main reason. What it tells me is in general, health systems are not being for public health. They're being for profit and or being reduced and decimated to the barest minimum in order to keep costs down for capitalism. And there's been no room for dealing with a pandemic. And they knew it was coming. They've had plenty of warnings. Epidemiologists and others have presented evidence to show that pandemics are on the way. We knew that through the closeness that human beings were getting to all kinds of wildlife, through industrial farming, through logging, through all the other ways in which the wild is being destroyed by the rapacious drive for industrialization and profit, that the dangers of these pathogens, for thousands of years in various forms of wildlife, could transmit across animals into human beings, and it started to happen even before this, as we know, with previous epidemics or pandemics. And only last year, there's a global monitoring report every year on pandemics, which the UN has, and they warned that the pandemic was coming. Governments, on the whole, completely and utterly ignored that and just took the risk not seriously and certainly didn't want to spend any money on it.
Okay. Government, according to Marx, was, if you like, the executive of the bourgeoisie, of big business. But at the same time, government, as you point out in relation to Korea and Germany, is also an instrument that's capable of carrying out policies to be able to limit and hinder or diminish the negative impacts of things. So how important is government in this whole discussion? And what is the likely outcome in relation to the role of government in future as we come out of the pandemic?
Yes,
what's
well,
the impact going to be?
Yeah, I think you're right, Heiko. I mean, if you think about it, whereas the first basic thing is public health systems. What are people going to say about what should be done about public health systems once we're out of this? Our politicians and governments going to be able to say, well, we don't want to spend too much money on these things because they're very expensive and there's too many old people. It's too much for an economy to manage. Taxation will have to be too high. That policy, that approach is going to find a lot of opposition now from people who say that, well, at least one thing we should have is a public health system that can look after us and avoid this disaster that we've happened before. Where's the investment in vaccines? Why haven't pharmaceutical companies, these big pharma, not been investing in vaccines to get these diseases under control through vaccine, which is the main way to do it, as we've seen with influenza? Why have they not been spending any money on this? Because, of course, there's no profit in it. So why haven't governments got sufficient public health system capacity to deal with the situation? There's no way governments are going to find it even easy to ignore that demand. And also, as you say, what it will mean is that governments have to play a role. Who else is going to deal with these crises? Of course, governments operate under capitalism in a remote way. They do not. There's no participation in many ways by the working class. I'm absolutely staggered by, particularly in the US and the UK, in which way the senior politicians and the senior civil servants are completely remote from what is going on in the communities, when clearly this situation was arising, was taking off, and they were living in a different world. They thought they could just carry on with their little models and that this would solve the issue, when it was clearly not going to be the case, particularly once we knew what was happening in places like China and Italy. So governments are going to have an increasing role, but what sort of control over the governments to do in the interests of labour is another matter.
What about the international pseudo-governmental organizations and economic organizations? I mean, I was reading about the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, UN, WHO. These are all global institutions. Is their role being sidelined, or are they actively involved in the reshaping of policy at present? Well,
first of all, if you want to take the health authorities like WHO, I mean, first of all, the US has cut back its funding on WHO, so that increasingly the only people financing it were the Chinese. And that's an indication of how the current administration in the US and others don't want to spend any money on these international organizations like the UN, like WHO, like UNCTAD and other trade organizations, which they see as actually looking towards helping internationally humanity rather than looking after the interests of America first. So we're having that sort of nationalism coming through, which is breaking these organizations up. When we get to the financial ones, they have done pretty well nothing at all in sorting out this mess financially. The IMF is increased its financing as best it can, and all it's doing is offering loans to various emerging market economies, the poorest parts of the world, who are being completely hammered by the shutdown that's taking place now. And the funding the IMF is offering is it's just like a spoonful of water in the sea. It's going to have little or no effect. When the IMF board wanted to double the amount of funding that they could provide, they have to get that approved by the Europeans and the US who sit on the board, and they have just not agreed to it. So there's no extra money from the IMF. And anyway, the IMF's conditions are full of things like efficiency, privatization, and all the rest of it. World Bank has virtually offered nothing at all. It's 50 billion, which is peanuts in this situation that faces probably something like 100 emerging market economies at the moment. So they're doing nothing. When we get to the Eurozone, here is Italy, completely hammered by the pandemic, spending huge amounts of money in its health service to survive. It asked for the Eurozone to help out by giving it budget funding, and the Germans and the Dutch say, no, well, the Italians, it's all your fault because you're all lazy and you spent too much money before. We're not going to give you any extra money unless it's all laid down with conditions on loans and so on.
So it's
institutions. So there's no international coordination or drive to solve this pandemic. It says every country for themselves.
So is the European Union dead?
Well, I don't know about it. This is. I wrote a paper about maybe 7 or 8 years ago after the Great Recession. I said that unless the European Union, or particularly the Eurozone, was able to bring about more fiscal coordination, so that, in other words, if you're in the UK or the US, you've got a budget, and that budget is used. If you take the UK as a good example, there's a UK budget, so that parts of the UK like Wales or Northern England or Scotland are subsidised out of that budget because they don't represent as much revenues to the government as is handed out. But that's because we have a nation. So we are prepared. London, which raises all the revenues, is prepared to share some of that tax revenue with Wales so that Wales is still part of Britain. Now, that's the only way in which the European Union could move into the direction of a more integrated economy if it were prepared to open up the budget so that the poorest parts of the European Union are subsidised by the richest ones and given help to improve their productivity, their incomes and so on, so convergence takes place. But that hasn't been applied in any way. In fact, the only sort of convergence they want is for them to not spend too much like us. They want to cut back on the subsidies, not raise them for the poorest parts. So the result is that you get a diversion. That when you get a crisis, that's when that divergence really opens up. So I think this seriously threatens the ability of the Eurozone and the EU leaders to sustain a united base. Maybe it'll survive because what alternative is there for a country like, I say, Romania or Bulgaria? Are they going to go leave the European Union because the European Union won't give them any money? Well, these things happen. What really would decide the European Union, which is what I said in the paper, was what the Germans think. Do the Germans want to maintain the European Union and the Eurozone if it means subsidising Italy and Spain and Greece and everybody else? Or do they say, forget it, we just get rid of them and have a northern European currency and we'll operate that? That would be a catastrophic blow to the whole of Europe in the sense of integration would be over. And it would lead to all kinds of possible developments in different directions in other countries thrown out, maybe good ones, maybe bad ones. But it would mean the end of the European Union project, which has now been around for, 60 years or more. And this is a real danger. I think it is a real danger out of it. Everything depends on how long this slump lasts, whether there's any cooperation internationally to help poorest parts of the world through and the poorest sectors of our society through. And at the moment, that doesn't seem to be the case.
And coming on to China, I was reading that the Belt and Road Initiative, so the rail and maritime interconnections, which China is establishing with about 60% of the world's population or 70% of the world's population, involves investments that are about 12 times the size of the Marshall Aid Plan in the 1940s. So is this a game changer? Are we seeing the entire rebalance of world economic power shifting to Chinese dominance?
Well, what we're seeing is China rising as the second economic power in the world now, no longer just a regional power, but now an international world economic power, the manufacturing nation of the world, the trading nation of the world. And it's also, by that ability with its size and the revenues that it's able to produce, it is also able to take that into the areas nearest its borders and out on its trading routes, as you say, the old Silk Route, but also the route which exists through Asia into Europe and other parts to provide support and finance. And of course, it's in the interests of the Chinese government to do that, in the sense that they would be able to exercise influence over those governments, but also get resources back from those governments for the development of China as well. You could say that's good, an integration of resources. Obviously, there's no, how can you put it, equality in the sharing of these resources and distribution. But what is the alternative to a country like, I don't know, Kazakhstan? Is the alternative to use American and European imperialist capital to envelop their economies, which is what they've been doing up to now? Or should they look to the Chinese? And where countries can't get anything that's fair and reasonable for imperialism, then they look for support from the Chinese to do so. So we're going to see that battle between how the resources of the world are going to be distributed, who's going to have the most influence over the countries which sit, and the governments which sit upon them over the next decade or so. This is going to be the biggest struggle internationally that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, which is now a major economic power Chinese rising power, and America still the biggest power in the world, militarily much bigger than anybody else, politically with huge amounts of influence and control over the international institutions, and of course still the major financial center of the world. So it still has the biggest flows of capital that it can exert. But now it faces a threat from China, both on the trade front and on the technology front, because China is now beginning to develop high value-added technology which compete with the Americans, and it would seem on the trade and capital flows front. So it's a major threat. This is why China is going to have to be crushed or stemmed or curbed as far as American imperialism is concerned over the next decade.
Yeah. It seems to me, apart from the government within capitalism discussion, there's also a discussion about government, if you like, the long discussion about China. Is China a planned economy or not? But it seems to me that those countries that certainly could be defined as being in the parameters of a planned economy, dominated by public ownership, dominated by Communist Party governments, whether it be, I mean, the evidence is not that clear, but it seems to me completely logical that North Korea actually has got probably no cases, because they just locked everything down and they had the capacity to do that. And they did it for a month and that was it, And it's probably true, in my opinion, that they did succeed. Vietnam as well, funny enough. And Cuba, my friend is in Cuba who speaks at Speaker's Corner, and he said since the action has been taken in Cuba, they've literally had people knock on their door 3 or 4 times asking about their health, their well, how they're doing, and so on and so forth. So they've got the manpower to go around and do checks on people. Linking into that was this idea about, is this a revival of the plan versus market conflict, which took place in the Cold War? Is that behind the whole thing now?
Well, I think that's some of it. I mean, I don't know about the North Korean health system, but it's clear, for example, the Cuban health system is one of the best in the world per capita population. It's got plenty of capacity. It's got plenty of skilled medical staff, which of course is exported across the world to other countries as well. And it was in the position to handle such a pandemic. And as you say, the other factor is that governments in planned economies, whether democratic or not, are able to impose the sorts of controls which are needed to ensure that their self-isolation, the policies of the health experts are carried out. And that doesn't apply in countries particularly like where capitalism wants to get on and make some more profit, and not just looking to solve the question of lives being lost. In capitalism, the battle is between lives and livelihoods at the moment. And when we refer to livelihoods, we're probably referring to the profits of capitalism rather than lives of people. In countries like Cuba, that contradiction is not there. It's a contradiction maybe between the inefficiency of the government or its undemocratic nature and the people, but it's not one between profit and life, which is what we have in the capitalist world.
Okay. Interconnected with this is this idea that is quite widespread and obviously has validity in various frameworks. So for example, we mentioned these organizations, World Bank, IMF, UN, and so on. There are a lot of people who are described almost like conspiracy theorists and so on, and say, oh, look, they'll find one plan, say from the United Nations, and they'll say, oh, this plan is until 2030 or till 2050 or something like this. And they'll see it as some sort of world order plot. And then there are other plans by the OECD, which might dovetail and might be different. And then there are plans by big companies, which might dovetail and might be different. And often, the big companies are trying to get a little bit of the cash that might be sloshing around for these type of projects. So what's the difference between plans by various capitalist entities and a planned economy? What's the difference between these type of plans and the plans of, say, Belt and Road in China?
Well, any plans that the UN presents require the action and support of the major powers. And they have to agree that it's in their interest to combine together, coordinate, and carry through such a plan. Like the Marshall Plan, which was an American plan in the post-war period to help Europe get back on its feet. So the Americans decided to make cheap loans and grants to the likes of the defeated powers like Germany and so on, in order to revive those economies so that they established not only a market for the Americans, but also established the basis of a new capitalist mode of production in those countries, rather than allow them to fall into the hands of labour movements which are moving towards communism. So a Marshall Plan got a lot of support there from all the allies to make sure that, and as it could be imposed by America on its own, it was fairly straightforward insofar as it worked. A plan now from the UN requires the agreement of the European Union, Japan, and the US, even if they want to exclude China. And they can't, there's no way they're going to pump money in to all parts of the world to save them from this mess if it means that they've got to use up their own resources to do so. They're not prepared to do so. They're not in the position where they feel if they don't, capitalism collapses. I don't think they're in that position. So at the moment, they're prepared. They realize it's a serious situation and they've got to resolve it. They're still confident that it'll all be over by this. If we're talking this time next year, it'll all be forgotten and capitalism will be back at business as usual. While they have that view, they're not going to look to cooperate. And even worse, if things really deteriorate, they could well start fighting amongst themselves about who should get the share of what is available to sort out.
It's like the battle over the masks at the moment.
Yes, indeed. People landing on air runways and pinching masks from the Germans when they're not looking. This is the piracy of American imperialism at the moment for a few thousand masks, but rather than getting on with actually producing them. One of the things we have noticed about this pandemic is that General Motors and other private companies who produce different things suddenly within a couple of weeks can start producing masks, ventilators, everything. It shows how we could reorganize society in the interests of social need. Rather than the production of the latest luxury motor car, we could produce the things that people actually socially need within a matter of weeks or months, with the workers' cooperation and the organization of these companies within a plan. And so insofar as a plan is introduced or imposed or directed by governments, suddenly things are different. It demonstrates, if viewers want to think about it, just what a planned economy could do in this situation if it was internationally based. But it's not. It's not internationally based. It's anarchy between the capitalist powers. So
this reset button they've pressed in terms of the economy, like in Britain, where I know that the 80% furlough, whatever they call it, is similar to, unemployment benefit in Spain, in Germany, or perhaps France, possibly Spain. But it still is a massive intervention. But what is the proportion of intervention that is, if you like, for the masses and the proportion for big business? Well, looking at both the packages for the UK and the US, it's about 1/3 for working people and 2/3 for business. And of that business, more than half of the 2/3 is for big business, straight handouts or grants, so that the likes of Boeing, all the big companies are going to get some funding so that they don't collapse or they can continue. After having used all their profits to buy back their own shares to benefit their shareholders, that's not going to change, but they still get a handout when they could have used that money to cover themselves in this situation, but they haven't got it. So 2/3 of the money is going to business. Of the third, if you like, that's going to small businesses, even that is nearly not enough. I tell you now, millions, and that's not an exaggeration, of small businesses in America are going to go bust, and then we're not going to see them again. The money that's supposed to be there still hasn't got in their hands. The checks aren't there, the loans aren't there, because this is the other thing. The bureaucracy has been so cut back in the states, in the individual states and in the federal government. Civil servants have been decimated. There aren't any people to process these loans and these grants. And also they have such antiquated computer systems, I was hearing. They're still using systems used in 1950s in these state and local municipalities because no investment's been made in that area. So the result is that they're not able to cope with the demand for the checks. The Treasury Secretary Mnuchin in the US said that he said last week, as of Friday, when I flick the button, everybody's going to get their money. Just press the button. So everybody's been pressing the button and the whole thing's crashed. Nobody's getting any money. So we have, on top of that, on top of the fact that
it's mainly money going to big business. Even that money that's going to workers and small businesses, and it's supposed to be a huge amount of money, at least only temporarily, is still not getting through, which demonstrates the complete destruction of the public sector and its ability to help out in this situation.
And this subdivision between the distribution of wealth that they're organizing at the moment, or the semi-redistribution of wealth that they're organizing at the moment, is even more stark in relation to the power relations between the wealthiest countries and the poorest countries.
Yeah.
So what's likely to happen there is it's sort of a sweep up by imperialism of control over these countries, just like internally in the powerful capitalist countries, the big capitalist companies will sweep up the board from all the small businesses.
Well, we've had since the beginning of the year, an outflow of $90 billion from the so-called emerging economies, the global south is the words used, all those countries which are the poorest or the weakest commodity-based countries, and big ones like Brazil and South Africa and so on. But $90 billion has disappeared. That was used to be invested by the imperialist countries and companies in these countries to make profit. They've taken all their money away. And now these countries' currencies are collapsing, and they don't have the funds to handle, but not only the pandemic, but to the ensuing unemployment crash that's going to. They're not going to have social safety nets like the G7 economies are. They're not in the position to do that. And as I said before, the international institutions really are not able or willing to help. So we are going to see major devastation of people's lives. Something like, I saw a figure, I can remember it now, something like 98 million people are losing their jobs in some form, either in hours or their jobs completely on the basis of what we see. So will capitalism pick up the pieces afterwards? Well, I'm sure they'll try, but this is going to pose also some serious political tensions in these countries. I mean, these governments are not going to be able to survive if they can't at least help their people. And if they're driven to the wall, I was just saying today that Indonesia, which is a relatively large capitalist economy, is taking the dollar swaps and other credits being offered by the Federal Reserve Bank to finance its spending on its population. But it's refusing to take any IMF money because it knows if it takes IMF money, it's going to be locked into paying back debt for the next 10 years or more under the IMF conditions, because the IMF is not changing its policies in that direction. So they're looking for ways to get money without having to be faced with yet more debt, and they're already loaded up with debt. And that's the danger that will come afterwards. Where clearly debt should be written off for these countries. But that's a huge loss to all the financial sectors in the G7 who have made those investments in the past.
And could there be, in some countries, hyperinflation as a result of pumping all this money?
I think we're faced with a prospect. Let's take simple economics. If you have no supply and people are given a load of paper money to spend, at the moment people can't spend it because they're locked in their houses and in their offices, and there's no way to spend it. But if a society comes back and people got loads of money, but supply can't meet it because loads of business have gone down, then there's every prospect we should see a sharp rise in the prices of goods and services, which you've not seen for the last 20 years, really. It's been a decline in inflation. On the one hand, we could also see, on the other hand, a remaining depression of unemployment because loads of people aren't going back to work because their businesses have disappeared. And despite they might get some income for a few months from the government, it finally gets through, but there's no prospect of a new job to return to start again. So we could get the position where we have rising prices in key areas that are important to people and still high unemployment. It used to be called stagflation back in the 70s. It's more like a depression environment with inflation. If they keep pumping in more credit and more money, they could create hyperinflation. If they stop pumping it in, maybe that will not enable them to recover sectors of the economy. So it's a dilemma which is going to exist after this pandemic is over. And maybe we should think about that. When will the pandemic be over? Of course, nobody knows for sure. We do know that eventually it will wane in terms of the infections. and the deaths. But it's to come out of the lockdowns in some of these big countries is going to take a long time, because the risk of it coming back, the infection coming back, and also how do you get the economies going back gradually? It's going to take a long time. I saw a figure which said you would not return to the level of production in national output of the major G7 economies for at least 2 years from where we are now. I think that's being optimistic. The Great Recession, it took just about 4 years before they got anywhere close to where they were after 2009. We could see it take even longer. That's a seriously bad prospect. Can you imagine if you were an 18-year-old and started work in 2007? By the time you get to the end of this, you'll be what, 40? You'll have been through 2 major slumps with hardly seen much improvement of your living standards, and periods when you've been in virtually destitute. That's what's happened to a whole generation of people.
Is it also possible, I saw on one talk, I can't even remember who the guy was, but it seemed quite to have some logical argument to it, that governments might be forced, for example, to raid people's savings, slash people's savings, just take part of them, and also to restrict the supply of money. So, for example, like they did, I think it was in Argentina or in Greece at one time, when they said you can only take so much out the ATM machine, to try and make their finances work.
If there's a run on the banks and the banks are not able to pay people the money they've got, then you get that sort of restriction going on. A run on the banks at the moment doesn't seem likely, because governments are prepared to back the banks to the hilt to make sure that doesn't happen. That's what that usually happens. Well, will they use the savings that have been built up? Yes, well, that's through taxation you can do that. And that's the possibility, is that once this is over, they say, well, it's been a huge amount of money we've had to pump in, and now we've got to start taking it back because you're all back at work. So we're now going to charge you through taxation some of the money that you got before. We're going to get it back because we can't have all this debt. The old thing we had after the Great Recession before. But as I said, when we discussed this, started this interview, Heiko, the ability to argue that, again, is not going to go down too well with millions of people if they have to go through this a second time, a period of austerity like we've just seen over the last 10 years.
What sort of opportunities are capitalists looking for now?
Well,
will they say, wow, that's a good investment now?
Well, if you're talking about finance capitalists, they're absolutely thinking about this is a great time to buy the market. The market went down 30%.
Big pharma, yeah?
Yeah,
big pharma or
pardon?
Big pharma or
big
AI?
Pharma, yeah, health, but across the board, they're keen that all this money's being pumped in, all this credit's being pumped in, that this is going to turn the major economies around before the end of the year, and then the stock market will be back where it was before. So why not buy it now and make a killing? So lots of speculation like that. I'm hoping, of course, that these speculators will burn their fingers and everything else when we see the levels of unemployment and the slump that we're going to see in the second quarter that we're now in and into the third quarter. Then stock markets may have a different attitude, and we'll see a reversal of that view. But capitalists are continually looking for how you make a buck out of a crisis. It's always a good one in the financial world in particular. That's what I would be sitting in normally if I was doing my professional work. I would be asked, do you think I should buy the stock market now? Do you think I should sell the dollar? Should I short the pound if Boris is in hospital? Those are the sorts of questions that people sit around discuss. They don't discuss, how do we save lives?
Yeah, for sure, yeah. Okay, someone's been asking, Jara's been asking a number of questions. I'll try and pick one or two of them. I'm puzzled by the lack. I'll just read them out so you get an idea, and then you can figure out what the track is. I'm puzzled by the lack, not just of EU coordinated response, but any serious evidence of an attempt. One, early on, 10th of March, Lombardy quarantine, wondered whether EU lack of coordinated aid would encourage politics to come of Italy leaving the EU. Okay, connected to things we talked about already. In the case of PPE factories, China are Chinese-owned, not European, US-owned. Why are there such lethal shortages outside China? I think we know that already. Terms of opportunities for socialist communist propaganda, a lethal pandemic like this, causing global economic dislocation, makes plain that capitalist life is political economy of life and death. Maybe to that you might speak something, because that would sort of capture the essence of what we're talking about, capitalism.
Well, I think what we discussed really demonstrates us that capitalism has recurrent crises. It can't handle this pandemic. It's a total disaster. It's forced to choose between trying to save the lives of the people they're supposed to represent and the profits of their companies. And they quick as they can reverse from one to the other, the better from their point of view. They're not looking at the interests of providing a decent public health system for people, so that we're not in these situations. All these things could have been avoided. That's the most. We could have avoided the impact of the pandemic. We could have reduced the amount of pathogens that get into human bodies by having a different way of harmony in agriculture. We could have avoided the pandemic by preparing it in advance, being prepared for it through the health systems, through research into vaccines, into the virus. It wasn't done. And when it hit us, and the governments were incapable of doing anything about it in the most effective way, with a few exceptions, and because they just don't have the health system to back it, and they're not even sure what to do. And now all they're interested in is getting everybody back to work so that they can start making profits. So that there will be attempts to get back to work before it's possible to do so with this pandemic. We know maybe they won't be able to do that because people will be outraged if the infections come back, and that's what they're worried about. So it's been a total disaster for capitalism. So if you want pop socialist and communist propaganda, just describe what is happening and why, and that gives people an idea of what this system does.
Yeah, it seems to have, by chance, revived the idea of public planning, of state intervention.
It's very difficult for government, the ruling class and the people who represent the capitalist mode of production to say to us, we don't need a properly run public health system. We don't need proper planning of our resources to make sure that this isn't done. We don't need to be able to control our pharma companies so that they research in the right areas for public health and not for things they can make profit out of. It's going to be difficult for them to argue that, much more than it was before this crisis. But no doubt they will argue it.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. Good insights again, as usual. Let's have a chat again. I'm sure you're doing lots of videos all the time now. So
just going to do another one after this.
Stream after stream. Okay, thanks very much, eh?
Okay, bye.
Cheers, man. Ta-da.